Linda asked me to speak about current trends in the United States related to the mass catastrophe. And as you can see, I've titled my slide "The Autologous Sling," which is experiencing a resurgence in the United States, as well as other potential interventions such as urethral bulking, which we'll discuss in a second. These are my conflicts. I felt it pertinent to begin with this statement from a great person, and unfortunately I use this as reference for the data that you've just been presented now from both England and Europe. We have data that is being essentially used by both sides against the middle. The data that we're seeing regarding complications is outweighing the data that we have in hand that states that indeed midurethral slings are effective. So this becomes a problem, and as Einstein wisely said, not everything needs to be counted in the way it's being counted, and certainly there's a concept of damned data, and the data now is damning us to this continuous and perpetual controversy. So the autologous sling is a marvelous procedure, as you know, is pioneered in the German literature essentially 110 years ago. Obviously, there is significant morbidity as the procedure has been minified with smaller incisions, smaller sling lengths. Harvest site issues have been greatly lessened, although there are still harvest site issues. The material heals well. It lies in an isoplanar manner with the underlying tissues, and obviously because it is host, it is integrated well. So sling surgery, autologous sling surgery clearly has a place still in the U.S. experience. The problem that we have in the U.S. is we essentially have a generation of young surgeons who have been trained on tapes and not this procedure. So with concerns, and specifically patient-raised concerns about the use of mesh, we are encountering surgeons who don't really have any other options other than bulking. And again, bulking is beginning to experience a resurgence in the States as well. So what is our current state? There are approximately 150,000 slings done in the last annum. This is the number is an approximate number because unfortunately in the way that U.S. data is aggregated, we have governmental data that's easily obtainable, but the data from our insurance corporations is much more difficult to attain. So this is at best a good guess. But and most importantly is the next point down. At the apogee of midurethral sling placement, there are between 250 and 300,000 done. So we've seen somewhere between 100 and 150,000 per procedural reduction in numerics since the experience with the mesh litigation. There are currently about an additional 100,000 non-mesh based procedures apart from bulking, and then bulking accounts for, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 procedures in the United States as well. So again, we've had a significant shift in the frequency and use of procedures for stress incontinence related to this. The FDA, our regulatory agency, has become very involved in this controversy. And in my opinion, this is unfortunately a representative of the fact that surgeons and gynecologists and urologists did not become involved as early as we should have. So the regulators became involved and basically made several statements. And you'll hear of similar themes in these statements in just a bit when I talk about another entity. But FDA recommendations included obtaining specialized training for each mesh placement technique. Notice they say each mesh placement technique. So if you can do one, doesn't mean you can do all of them. And you must be, as an implanting surgeon, aware of the risks. And this, again, gets to another medical legal problem that we've run into, which I'll also highlight for you in a moment. You must be vigilant for potential adverse events, obviously, especially erosion and infection. Interestingly enough, though, as we all know, if we take out erosion from the equation, actually the adverse events are very similar to all of our other surgical procedures for stress incontinence. And then watch for complications associated with the tools used in the mesh placement, especially bowel bladder and blood vessel perforations. And this gets to the crux of what we finally determined in the States, that a large proportion of our mesh complications are not due to the mesh. It's the person inserting the mesh. And unfortunately, we've had a problem with training. And we assume that one size fit all in terms of the training sessions and also in terms of surgical technique. And I know surgeons hate to admit this, but we're not all created equal. Some are better technicians than others, and some require a longer learning curve. And unfortunately, the mesh has taught us that. Obviously, the other aspect of the mesh recommendations was a patient engagement and information, very similar to what Dudley said, and actually much of the U.S. experience is paralleling in a way what's going on in the U.K. You must inform the patients additionally of the potential for serious complications that may affect their quality of life, inclusive of their sexual function, which again is a very important aspect of what we've learned from the mesh litigation, and that you should provide the patients with a written copy of the patient labeling, otherwise known as the indications for use, IFU, from the specific manufacturer that you're using the mesh from. And I'll discuss what the IFU says in a moment. This is what's happened, very similar to the UK. The media has become very involved in this. Now, this is a specific media article from 2014 about one of the companies, and what I want you to note is the relatively large numeric US dollar amount from the settlement related to the litigation that is still currently ongoing. There have been several settlements in the U.S. of approximately this size, and as many of you know, this has forced several of the companies to either leave this market or to actually to be forced out of existence. So the media has really made this a cause célèbre, and it really has roiled the patient's perception of options related to this. This is from the FDA statement. This is a very recent event in April of this year. The FDA said mesh for prolapse banned, cannot be used because of the lack of data. There had been an attempt to obtain data, but the accrual in the various what are called 522 studies, which are essentially registry type studies, was too slow in coming. So the FDA has banned the marketing and promotion of pelvic organ prolapse mesh, not midurethral tape mesh. And this becomes a very interesting aspect of the argument that we're dealing with from our medical legal environment, which is that all mesh is bad and that mesh has the potential for malignant degeneration and or autoimmune disease causation, both of which are obviously spurious or specious arguments, but unfortunately that also has gotten into the press, which has then come to patients and influenced patients' decision making. So there's a term called the learned intermediary. This is a legal term, and I learned this from one of our very famous plaintiffs barristers in the United States who practices in New York. And this is essentially, we have the patient, we have the company, and we're the intermediary between the patient and the company. And we are expected to be able to give the patient appropriate informed consent and full informed consent. And so the learned intermediary is us. We're supposed to be learned about this. And where do we get our information? Well, from places like the indication for use, IFU. All medical devices manufactured in the United States or marketed by U.S. Corporations must have an indications for use. And as you can see, the indications for use essentially summarizes statements related to the indications for and limitations related to the various medical device being implanted. There must be an explicit delineation of complications in the IFU, and there must be an approved knowledge base for the product as adjudicated by regular authorities that's incorporated in that. Well, why is this important? Because as part of our litigation mess, the companies are saying that the patient should have been informed by the doctors because it was in the indications for use. Very few of us, I think, spend any time reading those pamphlets on the back table of the surgical suite as we're preparing a procedure. So the indications for use actually, although a very important aid, is only recently come to light as a part of the litigation settlements ongoing. So let's define our patient population. This is another area of concern. I think most of us who do a lot of incontinence would agree the majority of patients we see with stress also have an urgency component. So they're truly mixed patients. So what is a true index patient? Well, the American Urologic Guidelines that were done in concert with the Society of Urodynamics and Female Urology state the index patient is essentially a patient with urethral hypermobility, demonstrable stress incontinence, and no urge symptoms. Well, this is an interesting patient, and they do exist, but clearly we know that there are patients who are complicated, the hypermobile ISD patient, the pure ISD patients, and not one size of procedure fits all of these patients. And the other problem with again, only focusing on stress is we forget about the storage symptoms occasionally, and obviously that's what can really aggravate the patient long term. So how do patients choose? Well, patients choose a procedure based upon what they're told, what their perceived bother and severity is, what their expectations and goals are, the amount of convalescence, very important, hence the fact that the midurethral tapes remain still available in the United States for this indication. They are concerned about possible adverse events, and obviously there must be a willingness to at least assume some risk, and the only way the patient knows about that risk, as Dudley mentioned, is appropriate informed consent. How do surgeons choose? Well, patient desires and expectations, patient characteristics, and unfortunately in the United States, urodynamics has become almost a passé examination. In my feeling, that's wrong. Where else would you operate only on symptoms without quantifying them, especially in a mixed patient? We also choose procedures based on available evidence-based outcomes. Our own personal outcomes, all of us are swayed one degree or another by our experienced complications or successes of various interventions. And of course, the impact of new technologies can change our selection of procedures. So what is the sort of the language of the land now in the United States? Do what's best, optimize informed consent. Again, as Dudley mentioned, very similar to the UK experience, mutual decision-making with a tailored assessment of the condition. Again, there must be patient engagement. So one of the outgrowths has been the real development of an understanding of what informed consent is. And informed consent has several tenets. clear and lucid goal, which is diagnosis, process of education, and essentially we must view informed consent as essentially a verbal followed by a written contract with the patient. In the United States, informed consent is a process. It's a discussion process, often with vision aids and other decision-making aids, followed by a signatory on a line on a piece of paper that essentially is meaningless without that entire process. The problem with informed consent is the literacy of the individual. In the United States, we have a great disparity in literacy, and it's very difficult for some people to understand the complexities of some of the conditions we deal with. So this requires time, so informed consent has a component of time associated with it. And then obviously informed consent must incorporate principles of adult education, which include repetition and again multiple methods to provide information, written, verbal, and visual. The American College of Surgeons recently, in response to all of this, has come forward with a more global approach to new technologies. And it's basically, they put out a statement, a procedural statement called retooling, which essentially means retraining of surgeons. This is important because it defines 4 explicit aspects of surgical experience that must be standardized prior to adopting and during the adoption of a new technology or even an old technology. Obviously, you have to determine the patient's initial skills. Harken back to my comment about skills. Not all of us are created equal, and some people are more capable with certain types of procedures than others. We must provide adequate training that is appropriately vetted. It's certainly a half day in a hotel somewhere in the United States is not sufficient. You must have mentoring, so once the skill is initially acquired, you must have mentoring for a certain number of procedures by an experienced surgeon, a more experienced surgeon who is experienced with that particular technology. And then you must have a mandate for reporting, otherwise, as Dudley said, registry. Now, all of these are very nice avocational goals, but unfortunately, we are not there yet because of expense. All of these require monetary input, and currently it's a large argument about who will support this. The American College of Surgeons has already established some training centers, but frankly, we need to do more of this in order to standardize our patient care. So I'll leave you with this drawing because it is somewhat symbolic. So in the 2nd century before the Common Era, king of Epirus invaded the Italian peninsula and defeated 2 Roman armies relatively quickly. Unfortunately, he lost so many of his soldiers and war elephants that he retired to Epirus, and essentially the invasion failed because of the Roman recalcitrance. And so that king's name was Pyrrhus, and of course that's been brought into the English language as Pyrrhic victories. The Pyrrhic victory in the mesh debate in the United States is by the legal system. You can see the amounts of money that have been made that really should have been kept in the healthcare system and rediverted to advanced surgical training and education. So what is our status? We have lost a war, and the war continues because we've lost a battle, but the war continues because we still have mid-urethral tapes available in the appropriately selected person who receives the appropriate informed consent. If she so wishes, that is an option in the United States. But as I said, other options are coming forward. There has been an impact in terms of overall numerics, but more importantly, there has been an impact on every unique surgeon on understanding better the informed consent process, which really should be a part of all surgical education, but I'm afraid has sort of dwindled in the past, but has certainly been rekindled by this experience. Thank you very much.